My name is Tess Falgren, and this is Samantha Burris, and we're the co-directors this year. And we're just so thrilled to be here tonight to share this anthology with you, this collection with you, Hearth, a global conversation of community, identity, and place. I also want to tell you that this event is being filmed by MCAT, and it's going to start broadcasting in about a month.
Before we get started, we'd like to thank some very special sponsors. We've got A&E Architects, Emma Pfeiffer, Humanities Montana, the Pride Foundation, and the Engelhard Foundation. Also, our incredible booksellers, the entire staff at Fact and Fiction and Shakespeare and Company. Also, our board of advisors, including Tom Benson of Arts Missoula, our fiscal sponsor. Also, Honor Bray, John Reimel, and Eamon Fahey. And a very special thanks to Barbara Thoreau, our fairy godmother. Also, a big thank you to our incredible, capable team, especially Nicole Gomez and Danielle Cooney, who coordinated all of our volunteers this weekend, and of course, all of our volunteers. Thank you, everyone who has advised us and supported us along the way. Thank you.
And also, thank you, Missoula. Montana is an incredible place with an incredible community. This place shows up. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being our home, and thank you for being our hearth. And now, Daniel Slager, publisher at Milkweed Editions, will introduce this very special collection. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tess and Sam. I'm really happy to be here. It's great to see all of you here this evening. It's a beautiful theater. It's my first time in here, so I'm excited. We live in complex and contradictory and challenging times. I'm not talking about what's going on in the United States Senate, but I'm talking about in these times, in this era for us. I'm talking about large-scale migration. I'm talking about refugee crises. I'm talking about climate change and environmental emergencies. I'm talking about disintegration of traditional social bonds and the dislocating effects of technology, which reminds me to encourage you to turn off your devices for the event. It's not all bad these days, of course. It never is. It would be so silly to say it's all bad or all good. But these are unquestionably times of great change and much darkness. Mindful of these challenges, but also of the opportunities and the potential in times of great change, two visionary women, Susan O'Connor and Onyx Smith, set out to cultivate a conversation among writers and thinkers around the meanings, ancient, recent, and contemporary, of the notion of hearth. Some of my favorite writers are in this book. I'm talking about Terry Tempest Williams, Bill Kittredge, Barry Lopez, Gretel Ehrlich, Bill McKibben, Deborah Erling, along with poets such as W.S. Merwin, Natasha Trethewey, Jane Hirschfield, and Christopher Merrill. But what makes the book so singular and exciting is the inclusion as well of writers I'd never heard of before. Writers from Africa, from Asia, from all over Europe, and from Latin America. Taken together, the voices collected in Hearth suggest that empathy and storytelling hold the power to unite us. This book challenges us to reflect, to redefine home and hearth as a place to welcome strangers, to be generous, and to care for the rest of the natural world as well as our fellow human beings. It is my pleasure and my honor now to introduce the visionary women behind this extraordinary project. Onyx Smith is the author of several books, including Homestead, In This We Are Native, Big Blue Stem, and most recently, Crossing the Plains with Bruno. She produced the prize-winning feature Heartland and was a founding board member of Robert Redford's Sundance Institute. Her travel and nature writing, her stories, and essays have appeared widely in the best journals in America. She was also the editor of Headwaters, Montana Writers on Water and Wilderness, and the co-editor with Susan O'Connor previously of The Wide Open, Prose, Poetry, and Photographs of the Prairie. And Susan O'Connor is an environmental and arts advocate. She has served on the boards of numerous nonprofit organizations, including the Menil, one of my favorite museums in the world based in Houston, the Orion Society, and the American Prairie Reserve. She also co-founded several nonprofit organizations, including the Pacific Writers Connection, Ala Kukui, and Families First, both in Boston and Missoula. And she too was co-editor with Onyx Smith of The Wide Open, and the two of them are co-editors of Hearth, a global conversation on community, identity, and place. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Susan O'Connor and Onyx Smith.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Daniel, so much for these kind words. You and Milkweed have been amazing partners to work with, especially the care that has gone into the design and printing of this book. Thank you, Tess and Sam, for giving Hearth the limelight tonight and for the great book festival you've put on. Our special thanks, though, goes to our team, our invaluable business partner, Minette Glazer, our consulting editor, Helen Wybrow, and our poetry editor, Sandra Alkhauser. Without these ladies, the book would not exist. We also received fabulous advice from our consultants, particularly Barry Lopez, who wrote our introduction and has been a sounding board from us from the start, and Chris Merrill, who is here tonight with us on the panel. And last but not least, a big thanks to the Prop Foundation for their support for our writers. The genesis of Hearth. A wise Hawaiian teacher, cultural leader, and wonderful friend, Auntie Pua Kanahele, sorry.
It's okay.
Called a small group of us together to gather around her on the final day of the conference on Hawaii's Big Island in June of 2010. Her extended Kanakaʻole clan has danced her traditional hula for us on the rim of the Kilauea crater that Pua calls her Hearth. She told us that in the Pele, or fire goddess legacy, the volcano is a living, creative, continuous force, tying her and her kin to earth, ocean, and sky, to myth and tradition, to generations past, present, and future. Now, talking to Pua is kind of like talking to the goddess herself. She is a powerful woman and very intimidating, but her words captured my imagination and laid a seed. We cannot save the earth from destruction, but we can start by knowing our own place, our heart-earth connection, and honoring that place of deep reverence. She suggested we ask friends to come for a sumptuous meal and ask them to identify their heart-earth centering place and to describe this intimate place in their lives. Something in these wise words touched a deep chord for me and made me want to know where that place is for me. 4 years ago, Anik and I were walking on the beach, and we thought this might be a perfect next project. So here we are. But why Hearth? Today's world, as Daniel said, is one of constant change, with 65 million refugees displaced by famine, wars, upheaval, and drought. We are a species who has adapted over generations, but can we develop coping skills fast enough for the uncertainty today? We are all, sometime in our past, immigrants, and so we dedicate our book to those who have lost their hearths, to those in search of new ones. One of the new generation's adaptations is a digital world where answers in games and entertainment are constantly available. What is missing from this analog world, from our analog world in our computerized lives? How do you replace the intimacy of a face-to-face conversation, the experience of beauty and wonder in the natural world, the sensual pleasures of sharing a home-cooked meal with family and friends? That irreplaceable, yummy hearth moment happened to me last weekend when driving with a group of friends at Skalkaho Pass. We stopped the car and wandered out onto a beautiful golden meadow with red huckleberry bushes and a sparkling dark high mountain lake in front of us. Wolves and coyotes were calling in the distance, and there was a spark of clarity and an instant bonding that happened in our group. Each of us has had a similar hearth moment, a feeling of being fully alive and in touch with our surroundings. All the words embedded in the word hearth have meaning for us: art, earth, heart, and ear. We don't want to lose any of them, because then we might lose our critical responses of compassion, generosity, cultural identity, and the search for meaning. All these important inner hearth words are needed for us to thrive in our fast-paced world and to enrich our lives and our humanity. If we become unmoored, we can return to a poem or special place to gain our balance and restore our hearts and minds. Let us continue to evolve into more conscious human beings. Let us embrace life and become more fully aware of our place in the universe. Our panel of writers tonight, including Anik, say this much more eloquently. So here's Anik.
Thank you, Susan. No way I can say it more eloquently. You are a beauty. And it's been a privilege to work with Susan for, I think it's been now 4 years on this book and on previous projects. As different as we may seem in some ways, we are very much alike in our ideas and our take on the world. And that makes us very good partners. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of how this book with 33 authors and a portfolio by a wonderful Brazilian photographer, Sebastião Salgado, how this came to be. There was the beach and the suggestion by Susan that let's do a book about hearth. And my response was, what? Why hearth? And then I began to think about it, and we started with the idea of the connection between heart and earth that's embedded in the word hearth. So we're both environmentalists, we're both nature lovers, and we really connect to place, and so that is where we started. And then we soon realized that no, actually there are other places that can serve as hearths aside from the connection of heart and earth. There are places that are in the community of people. There are places that are in a spiritual life. There are places that are in an intellectual life. There are places which have to do with a culture, an identity, an ethnicity. And all of these things can be considered as the centering place, the sanctuary to which we return to find meaning and importance and value, connection. So we enlarged our idea of hearth by quite a lot. And then we had to define what we meant. And that took us a long time to try and figure out how to define what we thought hearth was. Then after we figured out pretty much what we thought, we had to discover writers who we thought would be important voices in answering questions about what their hearth was and what they considered hearth and why they considered hearth important. So we set upon this long road of finding the right voices. There were friends of ours who were great writers, wonderful writers, and we did not ask them because we didn't want to have too similar of voices coming forward. We wanted to have diversity of voices, diversity of cultures, diversity of opinions. So, sorry, we regret they weren't here, but we had to skip over some friends. And there were other friends that we thought, oh, these people have a particular take that we're really interested in, like Bill McKibben, who has organized the 350 organization to fight climate change and done it mostly through technology, organizing by way of social media. And so we asked Bill McKibben to write a piece. And then there was people like Terry Williams, who has been working with the national parks and public lands. And so we thought, well, maybe she could write us something about public lands, and so on. So we did include some of our friends, but then we ran out. And we thought, well, these are all mostly American people, and they're friends of ours, and we want different voices. So we went to Chris Merrill, who is the director of the International Writers Program at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, and travels the world and brings writers from all over the world to Iowa. And he gave us this marvelous list of people, most of whom we had never heard of. And then we went to Frank Stewart, who is the publisher of a magazine called Manoa, and professor at the University of Hawaii, specializing in Pacific Rim literature, and asked him if he had any suggestions, and he did. And of course, these were also people we didn't know. So we started writing letters to all these writers, known and unknown, saying if they would be interested in writing an original piece for an anthology discussing the meanings and importance of hearth, personal hearths, communal hearths, whatever they thought was important. And we got this astounding response. So many writers said yes, even if they weren't really excited about the idea, like Gretel will tell you. So they said yes, and we said, well, what would you like to write about? And then they wrote us paragraphs about the subject matter that they would like to cover. And we were just wowed, weren't we, by the diversity and the interesting stories that these writers had to tell. And so we contracted with a bunch of, actually it turned out to be 32 writers plus Barry Lopez, who, as Susan said, was one of our supporters from the beginning and an inspiration, and wrote the foreword for this book. And they wrote us these original pieces, and then we had to edit them. And so I'm an editor from way back in my young days, and we were suggested another editor, Helen Wybrow, who is now the sort of editor-at-large for Orion Magazine, and had been an editor at Norton, has an organic farm and retreat center in Vermont. And Helen joined our team, and she was invaluable. She's a wonderful editor. And of course, we had Minette Glazer, and Minette kind of kept all of, I mean, I'm a terrible scatterbrain and postpone everything until the last minute, and Susan is better, but Minette kept us going. Minette kept the whole project going with her organization skills and her sharp mind and her comments. So she is a really invaluable part of this team, and I want to thank her personally. Okay, and we decided we needed help, so we got Chris Merrill, we got Barry Lopez, and we got a whole group of other consultants, including Puolani Kanahele from Hawaii, and Barbara Ross, who is an editor at Trinity University Press, and Frank Stewart, and Bill Kittredge, who I know very well. And they really helped us to come forward with, instead of a bunch of diverse and sort of scattered pieces, to put the pieces together into a picture that means something. And that was the job of organization. So once we got the pieces, we had to figure out how to put them together. One of our consultants said, oh, just do it alphabetically. That's the easiest way. And we thought, oh yeah, especially after spending months trying to figure out other ways to put them together. And when we found this wonderful publisher, Milkweed, who was a perfect match for us, and their staff began to look at the book, and we had a kind of tentative organization, and they said, look, why don't we just divide it into 3 parts, heart, earth, art, all derived from the word hearth. And lo and behold, the pieces fit together under that rubric, and that's the book that we have. So we're very lucky. Now all we have to do is sell it. And with that, I want to introduce you to a writer that's going to be our first speaker, and that's my dear friend Gretel Ehrlich. Gretel is the author of 15 books, including The Solace of Open Spaces, a record of her first years living on the Wyoming range, cowboying and herding sheep, this for a girl from Santa Barbara. And then she wrote, another of her books is called A Match to the Heart, which is a memoir about being hit by lightning, actually twice, on her ranch, and facing death or the destruction of her nervous system as part of that, coming back from that. Her most recent book, Facing the Wave, is a record of the responses of Japanese people to the tsunami that hit their coast and ruined so much of that coastline and those towns and that culture. And Gretel went there and interviewed people and traveled through the cities and wrote this beautiful, beautiful book, which received the PEN/Faulkner Award for Nonfiction and was nominated for the National Book Award. She is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Whiting Award, 3 National Geographic Expedition grants, and an award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Gretel has traveled by dog sled with subsistence Inuit hunters at the top of Greenland for 20 years, and as a result has written extensively about climate change and her great love, which is ice. So now you want to introduce?
Or do you want to?
Go ahead.
I'm going to introduce Chris Merrill, our second panelist, and he has published 6 collections of poetry, including Brilliant Water and Watch Fire, for which he received the Lavin Younger Poets Award from the Academy of American Poets. He has also edited many volumes and works of translation, as well as 6 works of nonfiction, among them Only the Nails Remain, Seen from the Balkan Wars, Things of the Hidden God, Journey to the Holy Mountain, The Trees of the Doves, Expedition War, and Self-Portrait with Dogwood. His writing has been translated into over 30 languages. His journalism appears widely. His honors include the Chevalier of the French government and the Order of Arts and Letters. Merrill serves as the director of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa and on the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO. And in April 2012, President Obama appointed him to the National Council of the Humanities, and he lives in Iowa, and he's my new friend.
One of the world's most traveled people. I now want to introduce Deborah Erling, who is another dear friend of mine. Deborah Magpie Erling is Bitterroot Salish and a member of the Flathead Nation. She also grew up in Spokane with a prizefighter white father, which she will tell you about later. She's the author of the novels Perma Red, which received the American Book Award and which they're trying to make a TV series about. And we wish her all the luck in the world with that. Her second novel is The Lost Journals of Sacagawea, which I'm not sure if I pronounced it right. Her work has also appeared in Plowshares and the Northeast Indian Quarterly, as well as several anthologies, including Talking Leaves, Contemporary Native American Short Stories, and Montana Women Writers, A Geography of the Heart. And she was the youngest and the last writer that we included in the fiction section of The Last Best Place. She's the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation, And last year, she was the director of creative writing at the University of Montana in Missoula, and we all hope you will support creative writing, which is on the chopping block right now. And I think she's taking the fall off and hiding out in Yellow Bay and writing. So now let's have our authors read.
So when Anik, it's true, when Anik called me or wrote me and said, you want to write something about hearth, I said, are you kidding? I mean, the world is coming apart, and my particular interest, because of all my years in the Arctic, has been climate change. I actually was on a dog sled in 1996 that went through the ice, and it was, 25 below zero, and the hunter said, this shouldn't happen. Go find out what's wrong. This shouldn't be happening. And so I did. But anyway, I got over my anger, sort of, and I wrote a piece that's kind of angry, but no longer safe anywhere. I don't care if I live or die, nor would I act only for my own safety. But I would like to visit a favorite place, the water-stained revetment, the copse of aspens, the small river flowing through a valley of willows filled with moose and birds. I will walk there and stay for a while, my family of one, the Kelpie dog and me. I take off as soon as the half moon appears, clouds dissolve, and Venus is rubbed bright. I walk on dead leaves and crumbling grass, a charnel ground of mashed up beauty. Up and up, past a cluster of wild raspberries, the fruit all gone, past the waterfall. Heat has drained couloirs of their plugs of old snow. I climb up to the open plateaus above and lie on spent wildflowers, pillowing my head on pine boughs. When daylight comes, I sleep. There was no way to see when the dew arrived. It was just there, gift of the night air. I harvest it because there's no water elsewhere. When it's time to leave, I walk backward, a contrary clown, back, up, until on a ridge where bits of glacier ice remain, I gnaw at a chunk and swallow 10,000-year-old rainwater. Much later, maybe days or weeks, I descend. Welcome to the nightmare, my dog says. Home is anywhere I've taken the time to notice where there is no I. It shouldn't be called a sense of place, but a flat-out, intimate sensorium where Emerson's dictum suddenly makes sense. I am nothing. I see all. Intimacy requires time. Time requires devotion. Devotion demands surrender. Surrender means sponging in the whole, season, light, smell, moving shadow, every dark place, every one that is bright. Nostalgia is the ornament with which we decorate memory. Parent, house, car, horse, beach, sidewalk, school, sibling, boyfriend. We tangle with love and loss, injustice, disappointment, with inexplicable birth and certain death, with illusion. Finally able to drop personal history from our minds, it pops up again, if only to keep us on our toes, to make us laugh. I was the night caver at the ranch and checked heifers on cross-country skis. Other years, I moved through the seasons on the back of a horse, by sailboat across the Barents Sea, or by pack canoe in Alaska. I spent 3 months in a tent on a glacial moraine where a friend was building a cabin. and developed an aversion to home as I watched the walls go up, the windows arriving. When I told him that a closed-up house seemed like poison, he didn't stop to put the hammer down, just laughed and kept building. Movement is everything, and so with us. We don't need the stable in any sense of the word, nor does the horse. We can no longer demand what we want and get it. The horse tried to teach us that a long time ago, but we went on with our undisciplined needs. Hearth is time as much as place, the time it takes for 3 pine logs to burn. It is historical context times birth hour. We are each non-specific and utterly unique, scurrying for a slot in a city or for a patch of meadow in some untrodden place in an overcrowded world. Yet sometimes we long for home, for a moment by a fire, a cuddle under a down quilt, a kerosene lamp on a dark night, or when very hungry, a plate of food or a plea for unconditional love. "Don't look back," Dylan said, or was that Theseus? These days, I wear red jeans and black shirts, red for fury, black for grief. But what color signifies our indisputable integration with the mountain under our feet or the subway stairs? In the beginning, there was exile from fetal intimacy to polluted air, from a vade-mecum womb to an ambivalent or serially absent mother and father. Family is a cultural construct that can be elusive. Blood links can vanish or sour. When things get very difficult, which elder will instruct us? What animal or song or dance or place will teach us how to behave? Once seriously hungry in northern Greenland, I was shocked by my atavistic behavior. I hoarded a tiny piece of salami, not from others, but from myself, saving it for a day when I was hungrier, then found it had rotted. I dreamed about lavish meals, but on return home, couldn't eat solids. I swam through constant hallucinations as I trudged along, not quite sure in which mirage I was drowning. So much of our privileged lives consists of flyovers. We wander not as the ancient Chinese hermit poets did, but in jets and commuter planes, a Cessna or a Caravan, wondering how we will recognize the proper site on which to build the hearth. We lurch from place to place, supplanting alpine vistas with desert, sand dune with cityscape, urban comfort with brutal open oceans, and back again, forgetting to cut through habitual thought so we can see what's actually there. Flying for hours over virgin forests, rippling grasslands, white-capped oceans, we can't seem to get close enough. The eye grows hungry. The road grows hungry for our feet. But on arrival at our destination, one of our many theirs, we find we've already exhausted a world we haven't taken the time to touch. In my Greenland home, the conditions in which sea ice can form have mostly disappeared. In West Antarctica, Pine Island Glacier cracks and slides into an ever warmer sea. At Dibengombe in Africa, the river is thirsty, the great herds diminished, and the trees are dead. Last week in Montana, 700 snow geese lost in a storm landed on a toxic mine pool and died. Dakus, a Greenlander might have said once, it means see you soon in a loving way. Maybe not. I still try to grow vegetables in a drought, herbs, fruit, whatever comes. At dawn, I collect dew and sprinkle it on my garden. So I guess you know the world is kind of coming apart, and so many people, out of this kind of dire carelessness, have let climate chaos hold the reins. And while not enough has been done at all, while many of us do things, but it's never quite enough. And so I'm constantly battling the fury and the sadness, and also the sense of, well, you know, maybe there is something that we can do. And some of the things we can do, I've been sort of living out in the boonies for most of my adult life, and or on a dog sled in Greenland. And but one of the things we can do in Montana is what we now call regenerative agriculture, which means, you know, your vegetable garden out back, or grazing cattle in a better, using timed grazing, and and redoing traditional farm practices, no-till, and you know, on and on and on. In other words, what everybody talks about is carbon emissions, but carbon, you know, is always present in the world. We just need to put it back in the ground. So I leave it up to you to think of all the ways we can do that. We can also all put solar panels on our houses. In Hawaii, where I live some of the year, the guys who help us with our macadamia nuts, who don't have much money, found they could rent. There was an outfit that rented panels, and it was, so they come and put it on your house, and it was still cheaper than what they charge for the really dirty power that an island uses. You know, there's all kinds of things that can be done, and we need to do them now, because you know, sea level is rising exponentially. And the most important thing is that the ice, everything that covers the earth, snow and ice, that the albedo effect that radiates sun back into the space is diminishing. And so we need to be, we need to rescue albedo, coming from the Latin albo, which means white. We need more white. It could be white roofs, or white pavement, white anything, just to send the heat, the overheating world back out. So when Annette called and talked about hearth, you know, I felt so kind of unsure of what kind of thing I could say. But I went back to Japan after writing about the tsunami survivors. I went back again last November to visit all the people who had been on my book. But one wonderful young man had lost everything, his entire family and his house. And but I saw online that there were these wonderful little pine cabins for rent, and so I rented them, and I said, well, how did this come into being? And he said, well, I was either going to commit suicide, or I was going to build cabins where outsiders could come and live, and then everyone who came here could be my new family. So that to me was a kind of hearth that I had never imagined. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gretel. Thank you, Susan and Anik and Minette and Daniel. It's a thrill to be in Missoula. And I thought that I might just say a word about how the internationalization of this project played itself out. And I'll talk to, just say a couple of words about some of the writers who are in this program, names you might not recognize. Sarah Baum, a wonderful young Irish novelist. Amina Hussain, who's a publisher, novelist, and sociologist in Sri Lanka. These are all writers who were in the International Writing Program. And Amina once gave a reading of her new novel, which was two love stories, one a traditional Islamic love story and the other a contemporary Islamic story, putting them next to each other in juxtaposition to see what kind of sparks might be created. Yvonne Ower is a Kenyan-born novelist who at one point was involved in the building of the new Aga Khan University, and I had the chance to visit with her and her team, and among the crazy ideas they were throwing out was, why don't we build a library of smells? And I thought, well, anybody who can think in those ways is probably going to write something interesting. And the last writer I want to mention, just because you might not recognize the name, but she's such a fascinating character. Alisa Ganieva is a novelist from Russia. She's originally from Dagestan on the Central Asian steppe. And she came to public knowledge in a curious way. She was known as a good literary critic. And then she decided to write a novel from the point of view of a young Dagestani man, one day of life in Dagestan, the sort of things that he might encounter along the way. She decided to publish that book under a male pseudonym. And as it happened, it was among something like 70,000 entries in the prestigious debut prize. This novel won the prize. So there was quite a buzz in Moscow. Who is this young Dagestani male writer? And between the announcement of the award and the ceremony at which the writer would receive the award was about a 2-month lag time. And so Alyssa and her publisher and the debut prize committee set up a kind of dummy email account for this young Dagestani male. And as Alyssa said to me, she got lots of inquiries for interviews and a certain number of female journalists coming on to her because who's this young Dagestani male writer? And then the night of the award, a black tie affair, which was televised in Moscow, the award is announced, and up steps a very beautiful young Dagestani woman, which began her career as a writer. And those are the kinds of writers that are included in this wonderful anthology. Hearth. In certain dialects in northern England and in Scottish dialects, hearth still rhymes with earth. An obsolete meaning of the word is hearing, which in my mind connects heart to hearth, since it is in the nature of the imagination to find correspondences between one thing and another. For example, the only usable fireplace in our house on Prospect Street was in the renovated kitchen, the masonry in the older rooms having fallen into disrepair before we moved in, so we spent much of the winter in the kitchen with our young daughter. The Dutch oven installed by the last owners was for show, and yet some days I swore I could taste the soft pretzels delivered weekly to my Pennsylvania Dutch grandparents' house. After his last patient left in the evening, my grandfather, a country doctor and water dowser, would climb the steps from his basement office to sit with me in the kitchen, slathering mustard over the pretzels he washed down with a beer. His witch hazel divining rod in my hands revealed nothing until he placed his hands over mine, and then it dipped toward the ground, his muscles tensing as though he could not control the force issuing through his body. Here was my first and most enduring lesson in the art of courting poetic inspiration. This I recalled while clearing brush behind our house the autumn before we moved away. Intending to plant enough vegetables to feed my family, I cut down weed trees, shrubs, poison ivy, and sumac, and raked them into a pile at the top of the hill. It took weeks of pleading and a forecast of rain to secure permission from the fire department to burn the brush, which smoldered for a drizzly day and a half. Our neighbors, an elderly couple descended from Woodstock's original settlers, did not speak to us for 3 years until the spring we put the house on the market. "Thought you folks liked it here," the woman said to my wife, who wanted her to explain their silence. Nor could I defend my decision to move halfway across the country to take another job. As for the cleared land, the buyers preferred a sloping lawn to the work of sowing and reaping. Corn, tomatoes, lettuce, squash, onions, garlic, kohlrabi, strawberries, potatoes all grow in my imaginary garden, watched over by a real, that is, American toad. Last night, I dreamed of the spicy sausages my mother served with pancakes for Sunday dinner, which we ate in the den with Lassie whimpering on TV, prompting our English Springer Spaniel to bark and bark. Why did I not think to ask my mother for her recipes before she started repeating the same questions over and over? The first known use of the word dementia occurred in 1806 as a synonym for idiotism, which best describes my reaction to my mother's decline before her diagnosis was confirmed. A doctor coined the term not long after Wordsworth completed the prelude, or growth of a poet's mind, which would not be published until after his death in 1850. Envisioned as the prologue to the Recluse, an unfinished epic philosophical poem on the theme of secular redemption, the prelude was his true masterpiece. "Don't you like me forget your way into the future?" the poet asked our class after my tedious presentation on Wordsworth's childhood theft of a bird trapped in another man's snare, of which I recall nothing save the music of his blank verse, which still shapes my hearing. But now from somewhere rises the memory that his joy at the start of the French Revolution turned to despair when England went to war against France and he was separated forever from the woman he loved and the child she had borne him. Also, how the Reign of Terror left him permanently skeptical of the power of reason. If past is prologue, then it is reasonable to assume that the series of concussions I have suffered over the years on the soccer pitch and in car accidents will afflict my memory. What to remember? How my mother listed an antique desk and hutch, the grandfather clock, 2 end tables, and the gun collection, including a Revolutionary War-era flintlock, as items for me to secure at the meeting my grandmother called to divide up her possessions. Because my parents could not attend the meeting, I was supposed to keep my alcoholic uncle from taking advantage of his younger sister, depriving her of what was rightfully hers. In this I was only partially successful, which I regret, though not enough to have apologized to my aunt, who outlived her brother by decades. 40 years later, when my sisters and I performed the same rite at Easter, my mother kept ordering my father to go buy Post-it notes so that they could keep track of what would go to whom. As for what I remember of our house in Iowa, that we had no hearth around which to gather as a family, and so we drifted farther apart. The widowers, divorced men, and bachelors walking dogs in the peninsula, a planned community built before the river flooded the only road in and out, nod to one another at daybreak. I was bereft even before my older daughter left to study in Strasbourg, her mother and sister having decamped to a suburb north of Chicago in search of a better life. Hearthward was the adverb that should have modified everything I said and did from the first days of our marriage. Toward, or in the direction of the hearth, as in, what can I do to help? From early on, my moral compass was set heavenward, for I was drawn to the writings and examples of the Desert Fathers who fled the city to live in caves beyond the Nile River, devoting their lives to the praise of God, becoming wise in the ways of the Holy Spirit. Why did I ignore the central precept of their faith until it was too late? And if I have the gift of prophecy, Paul wrote to the Corinthians, and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. I can now say with certainty that I am nothing, unable even to trace the outlines of the mountains rising in the distance, much less predict what will become of us. When the river spilled over the banks and carried away our neighbors' houses, we were grateful to be living on the high ground. And though I strained the muscles in my back, filling sandbags to pile around the water treatment plant, the library, and the house of an art professor, I did not believe I would be absolved. Eventually, the water subsided. The debris lodged against the damaged bridges floated downriver. The National Guard removed the sandbags and stored them for the next flood. The family we took in hung their wet clothes along the fence in our backyard, devising plans to return to their home in Mosquito Flats. It was true that I wrote them off as victims of a delusion, failing to grasp how their love of home and hearth bound them ever tighter together. Time to heed the wisdom of this sentence rendered into English by Thomas Merton. It was said of Abbot Agotho that for 3 years he carried a stone in his mouth until he learned to be silent. Thank you.
Tess, can you keep me on task? I don't want to go long. So I think I'm talking too long here. 7 minutes maybe. I think we're all, I don't know, blown away by what's happened this week and sexual assault and violence against women. And I have a particular concern for missing murdered Indigenous women. And I've been asked, how has that happened? So couched within an essay called The Great Big Rickety World My Father Saved Me From is a brief excerpt of what happened to me when I was in college, and a piece where my father saved me from this man. He met me at the door, and before he invited me inside, he offered to carry my boxes in. I don't think I'd said a word when he opened up the hatchback and began hoisting up a stack of my boxes. "My name's Vince," he said. He headed for the house, and I followed, skunked, unable to extract myself without insult. Vince wasn't what I expected. I thought he'd be a jolly sort, maybe older, too old to chase me. This guy was a middle-aged man with grease-combed hair. He was wiry and moved fast. He urged me upstairs to show me the place he was renting. I followed like an idiot, clutching my keys in my knuckles. Was this the man my father had warned me about? When no one spoke of rape or murder or the terrible things that happen to women and girls. Pink billowy curtains hissed in the wide open room and floated up around me. Dead moss dusted the floor. I looked out the windows in every direction and saw that I was clearly in trouble, except where the big red barn stubbled cornfields surrounded us. The nearest house was a mile or more away. What had looked so charming and inviting as I had driven up suddenly looked sinister and inescapable. No one would hear me. "What do you think?" he said. "Suit you?" "Yes," I lied, bargaining with myself. If I could get out of here, I'd never come back. I was relieved when he turned and clattered back down the stairs. I was ready to make a run for it, but he stood in front of the door. "Sit down, have a cup of coffee," he said. "No," I said, "I really gotta go." "What's your hurry?" Vince said. He poured me a cup and gestured for me to sit. I sat down reluctantly, ready to sprint, my posture straight back, alert. Vince slowly lowered a heaping spoonful of sugar into his coffee and made a tinkling noise as he stirred and stirred. He lit a cigarette and took a long drag. "My wife left me about 6 months ago," he said. He squinted at me through a haze of smoke. She lives up the road a ways. That's too bad, I said. I looked at my watch. He snorted and cupped his cigarette in his palm before he tapped it in the ashtray. He had an odd and healthy cast to his face, a pukey greenish gray that matched his hair. Left me for my field hand, he said, as he thumbed his brow. His eyes were as oily as his pores. You see that corn chopper back there? He swiped his hand toward the window. That big thing by the barn door, see that there? He sniffled as if he were proud. That's a stationary corn chopper. I followed his glance, ready to make my exit. You feed the corn into the bottom there, he said, and took a long draw on his cigarette and then pulled the cherry off. When that sucker jams, he squished the cigarette into the ashtray and held a pull of smoke. Let me tell you, you don't want to kick it, because if that sucker catches, he drew out every line. Pausing too long after each statement, he was revealing a secret, and I was transfixed with the horror of what he was telling me, not quite believing what I was hearing. I found him near upside down, he said. He must have kicked it hard because it pulled him right up into the blades. You mean, I began saying, your wife's boyfriend, not finishing, was killed right there? He nodded. Creepy, smug, and smiling, he raked his nicotine fingers through his hair, and I felt a shiver lick my spine. I focused on extracting myself from the room, extricating myself from his presence. I nodded my head in deference to him, acquiescent, seeking mercy.
Well, thank you guys. I think you get a taste of the variety and the depth of the stories that you'll find inside this book. And there's stories from Kenya and immigrants from Vietnam who were boat people and settled in Oakland and then went back to Vietnam, and a story of a Indian doctor who goes back to her homeland and tries to do good and is confronted by the age-old hierarchies of the village and the prejudices of that land. There's just a whole host of things in here. But plus I wanted to point out the photographs. I don't think anyone's mentioned a photographic portfolio by the great Brazilian photographer Sebastião Salgado. And if you have not seen his work, especially his book Genesis, I suggest that you look it up. And we have 6 photographs by Salgado in this book to give a visual counterpart. It stands as an essay, a photographic essay in itself. These are not illustrations. These are deep thoughts and considerations and visions of the Genesis and the enduring things of life on earth. And so I hope you check them out. So we want to open up a discussion among all of our people here and have them talk, and then eventually we will turn the questions over to you. So Susan, do you want to ask the first question?
You go ahead.
I go ahead. I don't even know what it is. Right. Okay. Okay, I think some of these people have addressed this question partially, but we want to know in a little bit more depth what the concept of hearth means to you in your life, if it means anything at all, because I think for some people it doesn't.
I think you should start, Gretel.
I should start, yeah. Well, my favorite hearth was, I've spent quite a few months in Western Zimbabwe, we cooked, why is this doing this? Hello, sound people? cooking over a big open fire with a great big grate, breakfast, lunch, dinner. And you know, we just sat around it, and that was the place where we talked, where stories were told about animals, where stories were told about climate change and drought and the desertification of the planet, while at the same time I made coq au vin in a Dutch oven, which nobody there had ever even heard of, and it was pretty good. And so that's my favorite thing, and you can make one anywhere. It's just a fire pit outside, and that was special.
When Gretel and I were talking a little earlier, we were noting the ways in which human beings as storytelling animals create communities wherever they go. And I see that every day in the International Writing Program, where we bring these writers from around the world, and in short order, they make friendships, they create bonds, and they have their own kinds of hearth. And as I was thinking about that earlier today, I was remembering that back in the 1990s, I was covering the war in the former Yugoslavia, and let's face it, this week has been a pretty dark week in America, but I was remembering a time in Sarajevo during the siege when there was no gas, water, or electricity, and I found myself in a basement with about a dozen humanitarians and Bosnians from the Serbian, the Croatian, and the Muslim communities, and journalists. And I was thinking today that in a way we created a little community there. We had our own kind of hearth. There was even a little flower vase on the table. And each one of us had different ways of responding to the great fear we were all enduring at that time. You know, one guy was sort of breathing very deeply. Another one was telling jokes almost relentlessly. And a third one said at one point, you know, what's the best book to be reading in a bombardment? Because we were getting shelled all around us. And she had in her backpack, she had a book called The Destruction of Yugoslavia, and we decided, that's okay, we're living through that, we don't need to read about it. I had the collected poems of the great French diplomat Saint-Jean-Perse, and another guy had an anthology of erotica. You can guess what we picked.
Yeah, right.
I think there's something in there about the nature of the hearth.
I was talking to Susan about this earlier, and I think for me, approaching the subject was really difficult because I realized, you know, even though I am Native, even though my great-grandfather was Paul Charlotte, the last recognized chief of the Bitterroot Salish, that I don't feel like I have a home here because it is an occupied territory. And I've never felt comfortable here. I've never felt comfortable in Missoula. I've always felt ostracized. And I think it's, and so it became a real question of what is your hearth? What is your heart and your earth? And I thought about, you know, later, afterwards, it seems like everything is sort of pointing toward the missing, murdered indigenous women and how long Native tribes have suffered under that, you know, since the coming of Lewis and Clark. And I think about all of the women who are buried in this place and murdered and buried and missing here. And so, like Susan, I'm emotional about the topic. But I also realized that, you know, my father was non-Indian. And my father was this boxer, and he married my mother, and I always thought of my mother as having, you know, really Native inclination. You know, my mom was, she was a full-blood. She was Bitterroot Salish, she knew the culture. But it was my father who really bolstered up my family because my mother was too broken to do it. And so my father was this person who, I mean, we had so many murders, suicides, car accidents, deaths of children, alcohol deaths, just one after the other. It was just a constant assault on our family. And there was my father, my tall father, who many would say in his later years looked like Paul Newman. My father, so tall and slender and so dignified, would stand beside my mother and all of us through all of these, through the wakes, through like just the whole family drama. And there was my father, calm. He knew that you had to get up in the morning, you had to eat, people had to be fed and gathered and tended to. You had to read the newspaper, and life went on. And then my mother and, I'm sorry, my whole crazy family on one side were just, I mean, the nuttiest family ever, like family fights and feuds. And I grew up in Gretel had asked me, well, what was your household like? And I thought, it's unbelievable. My aunt was a prostitute and was big in Wallace, and so I grew up with, but I thought prostitution and I thought those kinds of things were normal. Really, I thought violence, and I thought that was all normal, but the only compass that I had was my steadfast father. So it became such an emotional thing to think about, like not the earth or the heart and the earth, but that you find your power, you find your strength in the love of your family.
Great. Susan, do you want to talk about what your hearth was? We talked about it in our introduction.
We did?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think our hearths change. I mean, we can move around and our hearth changes. And so when I lived in Valley of the Moon, I had a hearth that was the grove of trees that I walked in almost every day. And now my hearth is in my home in Missoula. But I also love the idea of a portable hearth, that when you travel, I find a rock or a tree that I make my hearth. So it changes. But I think all hearths are so different, as we've shared tonight. And the question I have is, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about your hearth?
Oh, I just mentioned that, and this is in the foreword to our preface too,
right.
is that, for a long time I wanted to think of hearth as home. And I have this great home, which is kind of a important hearth for me. And then I started thinking about it, and I thought about the dish my Hungarian Jewish grandmother used to make for all celebrations, which now my sisters and I make, and our sons and daughters make, and my grandchildren are starting to make. And this is called, chirka paprikash, chicken paprika with dumplings. And so I think in some kind of way that recipe that's passed down through my family in generations is a kind of a hearth, and it is a portable hearth. So that's one version.
Yeah. So our second question is, what is the relevance of hearth in our world today? Is there such a thing as a new hearth? Is it relevant? Do we need a hearth?
I think it's more relevant than ever before. I think we need a place, but one of the things that I think we need to do is hunker in place, because when you look at, when you were talking about carbon emissions, there's a curious thing. We want to go out in the world and seek other cultures. We want to understand, but at the same time, every time you travel, and the weird thing I was just reading about, do you know if you, we think it's, I guess it's safe somehow or more earth-friendly to be cremated, but it said, every person that's cremated, it's the expense of 500 miles. It costs the earth 500 miles. I was like, that's a lot. So, and I'm gonna bring up my partner, Robert, but I love going home to Monument, Oregon, where he's from. And I've got to say, one of the biggest draws for me is that everybody who's there they don't leave. Like, they travel to John Day, and that's about, like, they go to John Day, and then they go to Pendleton, and that's Portland, maybe once in a lifetime or something, but that's a big deal. But people stay in place, and I think about their carbon imprint on the earth, and it is, leave a rich, full life, and they're not traveling. And I find myself more and more wanting to say, like, where is it that I want to be? Where do I want to stay put? And even if it means nothing to the world at large, like, where do I want to be, and how can I limit my own imprint? How can I limit my own, like, what we've done to this world? And I think, like, I look at all of us here on stage, and we're all older. And I think about the young people, and you know, and I just think about that travel, and I think about, like, even getting rid of my. Sorry, I feel embarrassed to say I have 2 vehicles. It's, you know, what is that? What is hearth then? What is it? It needs to be a stationary place, it seems to me, as we move into this world. But we're going to be moving, we're going to be uprooted by climate change, by fires, by floods, by devastation. Like, and how do we find a rooted home?
Okay. Chris?
I think I might just say that one of the tutelary spirits of this book is the poet W.S. Merwin, and we have his poems, and I for 4 years had the good luck to house sit for him when he would travel to the mainland and then travel to his place in France. He lives in Maui, and what he did with this land, it was he had 19 acres of land that had been pineappled for years, so that the land was completely spent. And what he decided to do, he managed to get some of this land in the 1970s, and he began to plant. First, he began planting ironwoods, starting to try to replenish the earth, and then he began to collect palms, many of which were either endangered or extinct in the wild, and started to grow palms. And he now has created an incredible botanical preserve. And I was thinking about him earlier today in connection to the larger climate crisis that we are all living through. And he was fond of saying that when we would get on the conversation of what to do in the face of these drastic circumstances, he would say, when you're driving down the highway and you see a terrible accident, you don't think to yourself, I wonder if they're going to live, or I hope they're going to live. You get out of the car and you try to help. And his argument was, we get out of the car and we try to help, which in his case meant to plant and then tend these palms that now cover the view. You can't even see the ocean from his house. It's a completely solar-powered house. They collect rainwater, and he's a kind of living example of how to live in the world and make changes for the better, and then to record those changes and those trials in the poems and essays and translations that we love him for. He's been a kind of model for me, even though I have leave far too much of a carbon imprint because of my travels in my job.
Yeah, grow vegetables, walk in the mountains.
Grow vegetables and eat them?
And eat them, yeah, and share them with your neighbors, yeah. That's all.
That sounds relevant.
Wherever you are, because you know, gardens, yeah, grow it anywhere.
Okay. Awesome. Does anybody have questions?
That's it. Yeah, well, never got it.
We have a mic that's going to travel around, so if you want to raise a question or make a statement or add to the conversation, one thing that Susan and I really hope that this book would become is a kind of hearth in itself, around which people can tell stories and have discussions and not be necessarily political, but to try and find the common empathy and humanity that I think we need to find if we're going to go on.
We have a question over here.
Hi there. I loved everything that you guys said, and I was particularly drawn as a former anthropology student as well. Somebody mentioned like a library of smells as something that one of the authors really turned to, and as somebody who's also drawn to smells, I'm very curious about each of you. What is your, and some of you have already mentioned it, what is your sensory version of hearth, you know, as any of the 5 smells or senses, and you know, any of the 5 senses. So what is your version of hearth in a sensory aspect?
I'll just say the sausages that my mother would cook on Sunday nights. It's a special kind of spicy Pennsylvania Dutch sausage that I've never found anywhere else, and it makes me crazy that I can't find that.
Anybody?
Go ahead.
You know, my mother used to say that there used to be a lot of rattlesnakes in Burma, and then they'd get on the highway, and then they'd always have to walk into town to get groceries or go to the powwow. So she said, this is so weird, she said the snakes, when they were smashed on the road, smelled like pepper and cucumbers. And so, like, I've never forgotten like that, you know, real attention to smell and the smells of your place where you're at that are so distinctive. And I'm going to embarrass Robert, but he smells he smells to me like whenever I go, whenever I haven't seen him for a while. He worked mint farms, and he worked in juniper, and there's sage surrounding his house. So that's the scent that he has. And he's carried it with him from Oregon, but it's, I think we all identify, don't we, by scent, especially, you know, when we lose somebody and we go to the closet the first thing and we inhale that scent, and it has something really particular to us that speaks of home, that speaks of place.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be thinking about mint all
My
night
husband
long.
died when he was 41, and I was a widow with 4 children. And for the longest time, I kept his pajamas, and I slept with them under my pillow to get that scent. And that was kind of a hearth for me, was that scent. And then, you know, time passes, and the scent gets dimmer. And finally, it goes away, and you get rid of the pajamas. Susan,
Any other questions?
do you have any sensory things?
I mean, this is really carny, but I was going to say love. I don't know if that's a sense, but it's a feeling. Love is the hearth thing for me.
We have another question.
A lot of the hearths you're talking about are metaphorical, which is wonderful, and we all find the richness of metaphor in the hearths in our lives. You've helped us to remember for ourselves. But I'd like to ask Gretel a question in particular that you all might like to reflect on too. Chris, and Annick, and Susan, and Deborah. And that's, Gretel, since you've traveled in the ice places, in the north and the south, and the cold places, hearth becomes very much a real and not at all abstract thing. The hearth in the homes, where people literally have to protect themselves from the cold, and where they meet, and the hearth is so central. I mean, it is in all cultures, but it seems to me particularly in the ice places, of which you are our avatar in many ways. And I'm wondering, with the change that you've written about so feelingly and so heartbreakingly, and the loss of the cycles and the advance of the phenology and all the other things that happen with warming, are the traditional hearths, the actual physical, non-metaphorical hearths of the ice places, surviving? Are the people adapting in some way to that? And how are they changing?
Well, first of all, there's nothing to burn the high Arctic. So there's, for a long time there was no fire, no heat at all. So that was sort of interesting. And then in Greenland, they, through the influence of Scandinavia long, long ago, they used little Primus stoves, like really old ones, great, a single flame. And when we're living out on the ice, we just boil water from ice, big blocks of ice. We chip it off with an iron bar and put it in the pot and boiled water, and then you put some big chunk of walrus or seal or something in it, and you boil that, and then you put it on another pot later and make tea. And so that was hearth. I'm not quite sure what you're asking, but
He wants to know if it's surviving with the climate change. Is the culture surviving?
Yeah.
If the home around the world, is the culture collapsing because of the melting of the ice?
Oh, totally.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I got thrown off by the idea of home because, these are basically semi-nomadic people and always have been because they go where they can find food. They're subsistence hunters. So home in our conventional sense, yes, they have houses, but they don't really care about them very much. And each Arctic nation is different. But yes, when you have a society that co-evolved with ice, and the marine mammals they eat co-evolved with ice, and then the ice begins to go, then what do you have left? Nothing. Or remnants. And in Greenland, it's the only Arctic nation where the culture was completely intact. The language was complete, unlike Alaska and Nunavut and every other Arctic nation. I'm talking about the high Arctic, way above the Arctic Circle. And their lifeways were intact. They hunted traditionally. They wear skins. They travel only by dog sled or helicopter. But they choose consciously what they wanted of the modern world and what they felt would be disruptive of traditional life and too noisy for the animals, and that traveling by dog sled was really the only functional way to travel on ice, but it has to be on ice. So so suddenly you have an open ocean and you're standing there on this rocky margin of Greenland, just looking out, waiting for the ice to form, and sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. Whereas in the old days, when I first started going there in 1993, the ice came in mid-September and it didn't go out till mid-June. And there was just no question you never worried about it. Maybe on those fringes, but the ice was like, I-90. It was just there, and you used it to travel, to hunt, to get your food, to everything, to get water. So,
Sorry.
So yeah, it's climate is also culture, and wherever there is, it's the same in the small island nations that those people are drowning, and it will be happening to all of us, and it is happening to all of us, that when things change, in such a huge way, then whatever the culture is in that place disappears. I taught at Williams for a semester, and in the environmental studies program, and I talked for a long time to a woman from one of the islands in the South Pacific, and she said, we're going to have to move, and I want to learn how to move the entire culture to have a place for us to go to and take everything with us, the doctors, the shaman, the people who sing and dance, the people who know the legends and the language and how we live and how we eat and how we cook. I want to take it all with us, but nobody wanted them. Finally, they found they could move to Sri Lanka, but it's not exactly a bowl of cherries there. So it's, we're suffering. When we talk about biodiversity loss. Biodiversity also includes cultural diversity. And each group of people who have a language and a way of living is a way of looking at the world and knowing the world and how to behave in the world. And as we lose that, we lose everything, and we become this idiotic thing that we are now in this country, which has no moral compass and no sense of right and wrong and no dignity and no respect. And so we asked for it, and so we're getting it.
Thank you. So this is kind of a follow-up question to the earlier question about your sensory experience of hearth, and y'all went to pretty much smell. There was a recent film on here at our local independent movie theater about silence and noise. It makes me ask you about, what about sound and silence and hearth?
So much yes.
Silence and sound, the sense of how that means, how that relates to hearth, or what?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about hearth, you know, we think about it intellectually, then you had a discussion about what it might smell like. I'm wondering about, what about sounds? Have you thought about it in terms of sounds? Sounds or silences?
Well, I know that I spent, and my family spent a lot of time looking for a land and a place to live in where we could not hear trucks and traffic. And we finally found one. And so there's a kind of silence where I live on my meadow, but it's not silent. It's full of bird songs and crickets and animals moving through the grass and owls hooting at night. And so that isn't silence.
There's no such thing as silence.
There is no such thing as silence.
It's just one element of sound, right?
So I don't know what that has to do with hearth necessarily.
Well, except insofar as, remember Thoreau's wonderful line that music is continuous, listening is intermittent. John Cage used that to make that brilliant piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds,
Right.
the pianist sitting and without playing. And it seems to me that part of our job, particularly as writers, is that we are trying to hone our listening skills. And that becomes ever more apparent and important the older we get. And I say that as somebody who now has tinnitus. So I actually almost like noise, because if it's completely silent and I hear the ringing in my ears, then I think, oh my God, I'm going to go out of my mind. So I turn on music.
And you write a little bit about hearing in your poem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is why my poem ends on silence.
Okay.
Time to go, okay? So let's wrap it up.
Yeah.
Let's wrap it up.
Wait,
Well, let's have,
is there
let's
time
have
for one more?
Let's have one more question that doesn't have to do with the senses.
Here's a question.
Actually, it's less of a question and more of a statement. Having shared a hearth at times with Susan and Anik and other people in this room, so much of what hearth is to me, I mean, you're speaking a lot about the destruction of the environment and the culture, and it's all happening. And yet there's also something that feels so even more important now, which is that gathering and that sense of community and connection and laughter and sharing of meals, and that sensory experience that is so much about self-expression and community. And there's certain pieces that we can write our letters and we can protest and we can speak and take action about what we see happening, and to live our own lives in more integrity and with less of a footprint. And yet it feels even more important that we gather and that we laugh and we share and we live with that heart. And we create art and we create community. And it's a changing world that we live in.
Yeah.
But how do we, the humans, we have adapted, we are resilient. And how to, I guess I'd love to hear you speak of that human resilience and the importance of community in Hearth and bringing heart back into our culture, because we can't change some of the things. But what we can change is what we bring personally to our lives and to our communities and to our homes and families and our tribes. So I feel compelled to bring that voice into the conversation. And I wonder if any of you have something to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anik, you should answer that. You should answer that. Do you want to answer that? No. Okay.
I have to say something that probably won't be very popular or nice, I guess. I think a lot of, I think, we're looking at times where people will have to be moving and will have to be shifting just in order to live. And I think when you don't have much money and when you're impoverished, like those ideas ring kind of hollow. They're hard to accept because it's just about survival. And I think when you're poor, it's really hard. The cost of housing here in Missoula is not affordable for most people. And I think it's going to get worse. And people who have been here for a long time will be driven out of their homes. And I think that's a nice idea, isn't it? But unless and then you think about all the other kinds of things we have to deal with when you're poor, like health concerns or health conditions, and you have families who are poor. Like, you may rise up for a short time, but if you have families that are poor, how do you live in a world where you take care of people and I think everything that we know right now and the way in which capitalism works isn't working for most people anymore. And and I think that we need to change that. We need to, the old hippies had communes, like they had ways of getting together and like taking care of those who did not have enough money or funds, or and that was the coming together. And I think we need to re-examine those ways of living. When you talk about tribalism, we need to go back to those ways where we can survive and hopefully thrive and live in a world that is a loving place. But when you have social disparity at such great, it's just astonishing how much disparity there is now. That how can you find that peace? It has to be for everyone, or it doesn't. I think it's hollow.
I'm going to I want to read this poem that's at the start of the book by W.S. Merwin, which I think maybe points to another way we can think about this. It's called Rainlight, very short.
Read it loudly.
I'll read it loudly. All day the stars watch from long ago. My mother and I am going. My mother said, I am going now. When you are alone, you will be all right. Whether or not you know, you will know. Look at the old house in the dawn rain. All the flowers are forms of water. The sun reminds them through a white cloud, touches the patchwork spread on the hill, the washed colors of the afterlife that lived there long before you were born. See how they wake without question, even though the whole world is burning.
I think that's a great way to end this. And it's the way we begin our book. We also end the book with Merwin. And I hope you think about this and take the discussion home and to class and wherever you go. And let's get people talking, and maybe there'll be some change.
Thanks for coming.